Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everybody. It's marvelous to see so many old friends on this webinar today, and indeed to welcome some new people. Please obviously use the chat function. I know many of you have already said hello. Please continue to do so. This is our final webinar of this particular series. I'm sure it won't be our final webinar, but it's the final webinar of the pandemic webinar series. Let's just remind ourselves where we've been on that. We started off by looking at what was happening with families. Remember, you got into the home, you started home working, your kids were everywhere, you wondered how to talk about it and what to do about it. We then looked at well-being because we could see that this was beginning to be an issue, and of course still remains an issue. We then looked at an area that is very dear to my heart, which is around how do we stay productive and collaborative in this new hybrid way that we have of working. And then last time we met at the end of May, we talked about leadership. What does it mean for leadership? And you remember we talked about narratives particularly. Well, today is about, if you remember, we initially called it the new norm, and I think everybody's completely sick of that word, the new norm. So we've made a slightly different naming, and we've called it embracing new realities. So tell us about your experience. Do complete the survey, the COVID-19 survey we've got, discovering the trends about what it's happening in your organization and in others. And also throughout this morning's webinar, we have surveys, and we also are using the Minty Minty Meter. And so if you go to the email we sent you, you'll be able to click onto that. And we're going to use that later on halfway through. I think you remember we used it last time, and it seemed a useful way to really collect data from all these marvelous people on the webinar. Okay, so that's how the webinar series has developed. Let me just say a little bit about today's discussion. We're going to look back briefly to what's happened. We're going to say a little bit about what's ahead. And then we're going to take a look at what we can do. Okay, so let's take a look back at what's happened. Well, you know, for some of you, particularly those of you in Asia, this was a journey that started right at the beginning of the year. By January, you were already noticing COVID-19. But of course, since then, it's played out differently across different countries, in part because of government response. And those of you who are multinationals, of course, are now facing the issue that you have to really be sensitive to different countries in terms of their own procedures. It's been a constantly emerging reality. Anyone who says they can predict the future is totally wrong at the moment. It's very difficult for us to know what's happening, and that means that all of you are having to be very agile, but also look really carefully for any signs of what's going and keeping very close to your employees to see how they're thinking. And I think, interestingly, it's shone a light on, you know, our latent expectations. You know, what is it that we want? You know, when we're in our homes, many of us are, and we've lost many of the aspects of our work, what is becoming really important to us? Now, let's move straight away to poll one. And this is a question about your experiences of working. And I've given you a number of alternatives. It works okay. Those of us who are working from home, most of us are, but I miss the social interaction. I love the autonomy and freedom and flexibility. It gives me time to really think and concentrate. I keep getting distracted by my family. I find the technology frustrating, none of the above. So let's just take a look at poll one, just to give us a sense check of where we are all right now. So let's take a look at that. 47% of you are saying you miss the social interaction of the office. 35% are enjoying the autonomy. And actually, you're not finding the technology frustrating. You know, by the way, just to remind us, it's been astounding. I know we have some technology companies in our Future of Work consortium. It's been astounding how the technology is held up. You know, I think even 5 years ago, the thing that you would have said most is, I find the technology frustrating. Families are less distracting, and it gives me time to think. Yes, nobody's finding it any more time to think. Basically, it's okay, but you miss the social interaction. The reason I'm asking you that question is because, and let's just take a look at the next slide. The reason I'm asking you that, oh my goodness, look at that, that question is, that's the question that I asked on the 18th of March. You can see I'm a true researcher here. I'm trying to get a balanced sample. That was to 3,000 people. In fact, it was the very first webinar I did. I did it at London Business School. It was the last time I was actually in London Business School. And I ran a pandemic webinar about virtual working, actually. We had 3,000 people on the webinar, and I asked them exactly the same questions. And interestingly enough, their responses were almost identical to the responses that we've got today. So, you know, one of the things that we have to think about in this new hybrid world is that, okay, you know, people enjoy working from home in some cases, but they do really miss the social interaction. And I want to come back to that because I think that's a really important point. By the way, I'm doing another LBS pandemic webinar with one of the senior people from Arup, which is one of the big design engineering companies, specifically about offices and social interaction. So we'll send you the link if you'd like to come into that. That's next week. So we feel very much as we did at the beginning, which is sort of rather fascinating, isn't it? So let's take a look at what we've been learning. Well, the first thing to say is, from the 18th onwards, HSM, my colleagues, engaged in a pretty constant process of learning and finding out what was going on. We ran the pandemic webinar series. Many of you have been to that. If you haven't been to all of them, you can take a look at them on YouTube. I have written a great deal about our experiences. I've written 3 articles now for MIT Sloan. We did a big piece in the Financial Times, a big piece in the Nikkei. We had 4 pages on in the Sunday Times last week, because of course also my new book. Did I tell you I had a new book out? The New Long Life was published last week. You can actually get it as a spoken book already, by the way, those of you who prefer to listen rather than read. And I also kept a personal diary. You remember this? This was my first diary. I have to say, this is now volume 2. So I'm now onto volume 2. So we've been keeping really close to it. I'm also, by the way, a member of the Council of the World Economic Forum, and we've been meeting in the council, and I'm there's only 2 academics in that council, me and a colleague from MIT. The rest are CEOs and ministers, and we met for 2 hours yesterday to talk about these issues. So we've had a pretty good network in terms of what's been going on and how people are responding. Now, let's just remind you that we've already reported on some significant impacts. And I want to just remind you of the 6 that are very much I'm aware of in terms of where we are now. Firstly, energy depletion. Many people are feeling completely zoomed out. We've lost the normal ebb and flow of our lives. Holidays seem to have disappeared. And you're struggling often with pretty low energy levels. Secondly, the pace of work has increased. In fact, one of the questions I asked you early on in these webinars is, do you feel you're more or less productive? Quite a lot of people said, we think we're more productive. In fact, I ran a CEO roundtable with Wired magazine last week with 5 CEOs, asked them the same question, and they also said, we think we're being more productive. And by the way, people are being more productive because they're working longer hours. And so they're working longer hours, and also some of the bureaucracy has disappeared. So that's good, but it's probably not sustainable. We'll probably have to find different ways of working. Obviously, we've had significant changes in the expectations of leaders. I mentioned last time we talked that really leadership used to be a status game, but it's now a narrative and expertise game. You know, when you see your CEO looking sort of relatively disheveled, with their haircut not very good, probably with kids in the background, then that changes their status. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it's a thing we have to remember. The veil of ignorance has been lifted, in other words. We've seen you know, all of the people in our companies on Zoom looking pretty relaxed, often not wearing their suits. And so all of the ways that we signal status are disappearing. And also we talk quite a bit about boundaries, that how one of the ways that we stay creative and productive at work is that we have transitions between boundaries. We move between work and home. Those boundaries have disappeared. And one of my concerns, and it's coming out in a MIT article next week, is about the constriction of networks. That actually what happens when you're working virtually, I think, but I don't know, there's no research on this, but I think, is that you're more likely to be with people who are just like you. You reach out to the people you know very well, but don't really do that serendipity that's so important for innovation. So we've reported on significant trends, but we've also, there's been a number of surprises, and I'm going to ask you in a moment about what surprised you, but let me just say that what surprised me was really three things, looking back through my diaries and the WEF and through our conversations with the Future of Work Consortium members. Firstly, I think that you were amazed at how quickly you responded. I talked to a CEO last week, and she said, we moved 6,000 people into their home working virtually in 2 days. If we'd said, you know, we have a business strategy to move people to their home, it would have taken a year, and we did it in 2 days. I think, and when I talked to her about, well, why did that happen so quickly? She said, we've thrown bureaucracy out of the window. This is the head of a business of one of the big telecoms. We've thrown bureaucracy out of the window. And for many of you, that's been a good thing, because you've been saying for ages, we're too hierarchical, we're too bureaucratic. So, you know, looking forward, one of the questions you're going to be asking is, how do we keep hold of that fact that we let go of the bureaucracy? We also learned quite a bit about families. Now, you know that I've been talking about families in this book and many other books over the years. This is reminding you of my 10th book. And I think what we learned about families is that we like spending time with them, but at the same time, you know, we needed to establish some sort of boundaries between our working identity and our family identity. And when those broke down, that caused us quite a lot of stress and anxiety. And the third thing, which I think people found amazing, was how many talented people there were in their organization. You know, when everybody put their hands to the boat, as it were, to row the boat, suddenly you saw people stepping up, doing things that people had really never done before. So we uncovered all these new talents. And I think, again, you know, as we think about the future, we want to be sure that we use those same processes to uncover new talents. So that's what surprised me. What's been the thing that surprised you the most? So please take a look at www.menti.com. Use the code 27966, and let's see what surprised you. I'm going to just let you type in. Wow. And Shu from TCS is saying they moved 450,000 people. Yes. Yeah, that was TCS. Yeah, well, that is pretty amazing. Speed. Yeah, that's coming up really as your number one as well. God, it was amazing how quickly we did everything. You wonder. Now, by the way, looking forward, it's fine to speed up, but we also need to take breaks. And I want to say a bit more about that later, but you know, we really, really have to learn how to work fast, but also work slow. You know, the think fast, think slow. We've got to, if we speed everything up, we're going to lose something. But certainly it's been really awesome, hasn't it? The speed at which we've done things. So speed, learning agility, empathy. Yeah, it was astounding, wasn't it? Although some of that's been washed away at the moment, particularly in the States. But certainly somebody said, I miss my commute. Actually, I've heard that from quite a lot of people. Remember that marvelous study that was done with Chinese call center workers. At the end, they were, half of them working from home, half of them in the call center. At the end, 50% of them wanted to come back into the office, in part because they missed their commute. So there you go. Who would have thought we'd missed our commuting? Speed of response, learning. So speed is technology. Yes, for me, that was, I've had a very bad internet connection, as you might remember from my last webinar. But in general, we've been pretty pleased. Missed getting dressed up. Nikki, look at me all dressed up. Yeah. Jewelry, makeup, hair, it's all there. Okay, flexibility, care, fatigue. Yeah, I think that's going to play out a bit more actually. Intimacy, agility. Oh, we'll try and send this around to you because this is absolutely fascinating. I can't see some of the little tiny words, but actually, you know, the big words that are coming up are how quickly we learned, uncovered new talents, how much we empathized with each other, how we managed to collaborate. And I think there's some amazing collaboration lessons here. You know, we've created this Petri dish. So thank you for that. I can see that you've been as surprised as I have about resilience, new connections. That's interesting, because my hypothesis is that we wouldn't be making new connections. So perhaps we can have a chat about that and talk about that later on when we move on to onto questions. Zoom, yes. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about how we felt, which turns out to be exactly the same as we felt on 14th of March. That's interesting, isn't it? We've talked about the surprises that we've seen. Let's take a look now at what's ahead. Well, there's three things that we know. There's quite a lot of unknowns ahead, but there are some knowns ahead. So let's just take a look at those three things in a bit more detail. Number one, we're going to go into a major recession. In fact, those of you who read the piece that Andrew Scott and I wrote for the Sunday Times last weekend, where we had a 4-page spread about the future of work, Andrew's point was that this is probably going to be the worst recession for the last 300 years. I think we're not really, I'm not sure how ready we are for that or how much we're thinking about that, but certainly on the WEF call yesterday, that was really one of the major conversations that we had on the call, and in particular, how we're going to upskill and reskill. And I do think that, which by the way will have to be a government. I think it's going to be difficult for companies to upskill and reskill, and we're going to have to ask for government. So one of the things that you need to think about going forward is your relationships with governments, because governments are going to be stepping in a way that they haven't done for many years. And by the way, we haven't wanted them to, but we are moving into a major recession. We will have unemployment. And on my call yesterday, one of my council members is we have both the head of the ILO and the head of the UNICEF on my council. And both of them are extremely concerned about youth unemployment. And so I think as companies, anything we can do now to make sure that we're still bringing young people into our company, even though the times are tough, would make an enormous impression on trust. So let's be clear that this recession is something that we need to really think about. The second thing we know is our business models have changed, and each one of us part of the agility and flexibility and speed that you found is changing your business models. Many of you have moved to digital, as we have. Those of you who are coming to our masterclass in London later on in the month, and well, I know we'll be welcoming all of our members from the Future Work Consortium. That will be, for the first year ever, a virtual event. And that's going to be true for most of the things that you do. So our business models have changed, our preferences as consumers have changed, and indeed as workers. So that new business model formulation is going to be absolutely crucial. And as you know, we've said in the past, we think that the process of co-creation, where we reach out to the people in our organizations, is going to be absolutely crucial for that business model transformation. And we're working with a couple of companies right now to help them think about how they move along business model transformation. And then thirdly, of course, we're going to have new ways of working, and most of us are already in the planning stages of hybrid working. We're already working out how do we manage hybrid working. So those things are all knowable. These are the known knowns, as it were. But there are uncertainties, and there's profound uncertainties. One of the most profound uncertainties, of course, is we don't know what's going to happen to COVID-19. And I'm sure all of us are keeping as close to all of the medical information we've got. I happen to sit on a board which is very interested in this. I know a number of you have got very interesting links into medical companies. Some of you are indeed in medical companies. And one thing we know is we don't know what's going to happen to COVID-19. We don't know if there's going to be a second spike later on in the year. And that means that there are enormous uncertainties. Uncertainties in terms of government responses, and uncertainties indeed in terms of individuals. We don't really yet know how we are going to respond in the long term. We know how we're responding in the short term, but those responses in the long term are still areas of uncertainty for all of us, which is why some of you are doing scenario planning right now, where you're looking at various options and working through what those scenarios might be looking like. I think there's 6 questions that we need to answer, and please do keep close to the Future of Work Consortium and close to HSM, because these are the questions that we're going to be addressing over the next month. So as we find things, we of course communicate them. Let me just start with this question of networks. One of my concerns, but I could be wrong, is that as we move to virtual working and to hybrid working, we'll lose diverse networks, and we'll lose bumping into strangers, and we'll lose serendipity. Now, there's an argument that actually, now that we're using Zoom and we have these large platforms, for example, HSM only last week or the week before worked with a major telecoms where we put tens of thousands of people together for 75 hours to work through some big issues. Now, those were strangers and they worked together. So I could be wrong in terms of networks, but I sort of feel that face-to-face with strangers and that serendipity creates innovation. But if you go into the Financial Times, actually, even today, you'll see in the Future of Work section, my piece on that is still up there. It's been on the FT Now website for more than a week, and you'll see a bit more of a description of why I'm worried about that. And I think, you know, we're moving into a blended world, and I think we've still got quite a lot of unanswered questions about what an office is, what home is, what the value is of being in an office, and what the value is of being at home. And I think, you know, we've got to work that out in a lot more detail. And as I've said earlier in our webinars, and we're very happy to advise any of you on this, and indeed we are already beginning to advise companies, we need to look at the level of the task to work out what tasks are best done at home, what tasks are best done at work and in an office, and how we do that. I think the big issue for leaders right now is building trust virtually. Many leaders, and you can see this sort of with Trump actually, not that is that Trump is definitely losing energy because he isn't able to address the crowds. Now, I'm not suggesting your leaders need to model themselves on Donald Trump, but what I am saying is part of the leadership process is that you get close to people. You know, you're talking to people, you're meeting people in the corridors. You know, we at London Business School, we, like everyone, are having a hard time. And one of the things that the faculty are saying is that we've become actually more procedural because we don't have those chats in the corridor where we say, well, hang on, what have you thought about this? And so those sorts of, you know, chats that you have face to face, which are particularly important for leaders, are disappearing. And so leaders are really thinking about, how do I build trust virtually? We talked about that in our last webinar, but I think that remains a very important issue. Obviously, those of you who came into the pandemic with a strong sense of purpose are finding this an easier process. I was in a roundtable with a very senior person from Lego last week, and she was saying, you know, our purpose is to help the world play. And, you know, that purpose is absolutely front of mind. If you came in to the pandemic without a strong sense of purpose, then it's a real challenge for you now. And then, you know, two more things, particularly about work, is how do we design work for everyone? And I think increasingly the upskilling and reskilling agenda is going to be uppermost. I was in the council meeting yesterday at the WEF. We had the heads of Coursera and the heads of edX, which are the two largest learning platforms in the world right now. I'm just sort of flicking back to see the numbers, but actually the numbers are absolutely astounding in terms of how many people are going into Coursera, which is they're providing free at the moment, and how many people are going in straight in without not going through their company. So you have to also realize that, you know, it's not that you're linking into these learning platforms, your employees are also linking into them. And so, you know, there's just amazing work happening in the world of digital learning. I think that upskilling and reskilling is going to be the major problem going forward. And I think that any company that's got a solution to that should be working both with their own employees, but also in terms of how they can support their communities, should be operating into their communities to see how they can help. And I know a number of you are already doing that. So please, you know, let's have the chat. I can see a lot of chat going on, but that's one question I'd be very interested to continue the conversation on. How do we do upskilling and reskilling at scale? And if anyone's doing anything interesting, please tell me, because I can feed that through to the World Economic Forum. So still a lot of questions to be answered. So poll number 2, I've said the 6 questions that are the most on my mind at the moment, but they might not be the ones that are most on yours. So, you know, of the 6 questions that I think are important for us to answer, which is the one that you feel is the one that you're focusing on right now, or the one that you would like to have answered? How do we retain diverse networks? How do we communicate and interact in a blended world? How do leaders continue to build trust virtually? Is our purpose future-proofed? How do we design work for everyone? And what practices so that the final one should read about upskilling and reskilling. But let's stick to this one. We made a quick change very early this morning. What practices will we retain and what will we discard? So that's our final one. What practices will we retain and what will we discard? So the number one, which is what practices will we retain and what will we discard? Yeah, that's very fascinating. But actually the others are pretty similar. So, you know, what this is showing is that actually all of these are important to us, and it probably depends quite a bit on our own company and the circumstances that they're working under. But right now, this question of what do we let go of is the one that we're most concerned about. And by the way, that's the one that you'll have to do pretty quickly. So, you know, joining people up around the world to ask them that question would be a great thing to do. And something, of course, that we at HSM love doing. Okay, so let's move on now to talking about what can we do. So we've talked about where we've been. We've talked about where we are now. Let's take a look at the final question about what can we do. By the way, we'll be opening for questioning in about 10 minutes time. So please keep those questions going. I can see that there's a lot of chat going on. I can't read the chat, but I can see that the number is going up all the time. We have a choice. And I think this is really the most important point, really, as you think about the future. We are in a position now to invent the future. Technology will not invent it. Governments won't invent it. We collectively can invent our future. And I think we've got a chance to decide what we want our world and our work to look like. So what can your role be in terms of inventing the future? Well, here's 6 areas that I think we can work on right now to invent that future. The first is around trust, really. How do you continue to build and retain a culture of trust? Because anything that goes forward is going to require high levels of trust between your employees and your leadership. And remember that what we know from a crisis is you get this high level of excitability early on, you know, as people are running around working really hard, but we are already, and you know this yourself, moving into the fatigue stage of that cycle. And with fatigue comes recriminations, you know, why didn't we? And that's when you have to start really building a new form of trust, which is trust that's not based on the crisis, but rather trust that's based looking forward. So how you bring your people together is going to be absolutely crucial. And I think, you know, just as you've said, the most important issue to you right now is what to discard. I think that the other question about that is about behavior, because your processes are what shape the context for individual behaviors. And so how you enable sustainable behavioral change is going to be crucial. So knowing which of those levers to pull is going to be crucial. Many of you have worked hard to create a holding environment for the emotions. And you remember we've talked about that last time in our last webinar on leadership, that the first role of leadership is to hold. You have to continue to do that, because these are, you know, will continue to be very difficult times as fatigue sets in. And 2 other things in terms of looking forward. One is to pivot the structures away from hierarchy. You know, a number of you said in your surprises that you were working fast, that people were behind you. This is the moment to ask yourself, what have we stopped doing that we don't need to do anymore? And so there's a really important piece there. And again, I think the co-creation, we ran a jam last week where the question was, you know, what do we want to stop doing? What is it that we don't need to do anymore? And the faster you do that, the more likely it is that those bureaucracies that you unrooted, those roots are going to start growing again. So you want to pull them out of the ground, as it were, before they restart. So to make sure you're doing that really quickly. And also, of course, as we've said right the way through this series of webinars, people love stories and they want positive, uplifting stories about the future. And your leadership role is to provide those stories. Now, that doesn't mean it's a Pollyanna moment. I don't mean to say that you say, isn't the world marvelous and the sun's always shining? But I do mean that people psychologically respond well to positive statements. They're energized by them and they want to think about the future. So the more that your leaders, and by leaders I mean, you know, right the way through the organization, can begin to tell a story about the future, the better it is for you to walk towards that future. So we, in all of us, have this incredibly important role to play over the next few months. Now, you know, that really tells us how, you know, the roles that we can play. But I think that we also need to think about what the guiding principles might be. And by that, I mean, you know, what's your compass? What is it that whenever you are now faced with difficult decisions, what should you go back to with regard to your guiding principles? And for me, there are four. Of course, the first one is purpose and values. And this is the moment to remind yourself what your purpose is and what your values are. Because as you go through the trough, I think there's going to happen, you know, as people realize we're in a recession, as your business model becomes very strained, as government puts pressure on you to do the right thing in communities, which they will, then, you know, continuously remembering what your purpose is, what your values are, is going to be very, very crucial. Secondly, you know, what I haven't done today is to give you a list of, you know, what your particular future is going to be. And that's because one thing that I've learned since the beginning of the pandemic is the circumstances of companies are quite unique, and they're unique for a number of reasons. One is the business sector that you're operating in. Secondly is the type of leadership that you have. And the third thing is the country and the government you're in. And so, you know, I've used, those of you who know my work know that I've used the notion of a signature before. And by a signature, I mean, what is unique to you? You know, what is it? What is your future that might not be the future of everybody else? And so I think creating this signature is going to be absolutely crucial. And the third issue is about capturing your lessons and experiments. You know, the virus created a petri dish for us, a petri dish of experiments where, you know, things which were unthinkable have taken place. Some of those things you want to now let go of, but others you really want to experiment with and to learn the lessons from. So make sure that the lessons that you're learning now are not lost. And finally, you know, what we know about job shifting, what we know about innovation is that feedback and co-creation is going to be really important. And let me just mention, because I can see some of the chat just vaguely coming up here. The other thing that's coming out from the World Economic Forum, and I know that and I also am very aware of it from my work with Equinor, is that inequality is going to be a major issue over the next year. And whilst it might be something that within your organization, you feel you're bounded within your company, there is no doubt that every company and every leader is going to be asked to address issues of inequality and inclusion. And again, as you think about the future, one of the principles you may want to consider is the principle of, is what you're doing increasing or decreasing inequality? Because my guess is that now that governments have got so involved with corporations in terms of, you know, giving you special financing deals, paying for employees to be furloughed, they're also going to ask for something back. And part of the ask, as you know, will be tax, but the other ask will be to help your communities, and to help your communities in terms of upskilling, reskilling, but also to address inequality. So you need, I think, at this stage to be briefing your leaders on issues of inequality and on what it is you can do. And again, lots of chat going on here, but maybe this is something we can pick up in the future and have something specifically on this issue of inequality. So these are your guiding principles, but what can you do today? And then we're going to, this is my last slide, and we're going to move into questions in a moment. So get those questions ready. I know Anna's looking at them carefully right now. Here's 6 things that you should be doing right now. Start a dialogue, which I know many of you have already done, to ask and listen to what people need. You know, there's absolutely no question in my mind that a top-down hierarchical strategy is not going to work at the moment. The world is moving too quickly. You're dependent on too many people. You've really got to listen to their voices and begin to tell that narrative. If you already, I can see the question of inequality is coming up a lot. So we may need to think more about that. If you aren't already telling a compelling narrative, then make sure that you're doing that. Keep those experiments going, learn from them, and think about experiments under a number of buckets. Experiments about where we work, experiments about when we work, and experiments about how things are done. Those experiments are already happening right now. Make sure that you're learning from them. You know, I said earlier, we don't know where the innovation is happening. Well, that's because we don't have enough data on that. So you need to collect data about productivity, about innovation. And I think clearly, you know, flexibility is going to be absolutely crucial. We don't know what the future is going to be. Anybody who says they do is wrong. But actually, we have to be flexible and agile about that future. And I think transparency is going to be really important. I think more than any time, you know, over the years in various of my books, particularly my book, The Democratic Enterprise, which I know nobody but my mother has ever read. Somebody's going to say already, aha, yes, I love the yeah. But what I talked about there was the relationship between employee and employer. And I said it had moved from parent to child to adult to adult. Well, one of the aspects of adult to adult is that you need to be transparent. And I know there'll be market sensitive data, but in general, I would suggest you as transparent as possible. And then also tap into your existing communities, not just within your organization, but outside. I mean, for me, for example, the communities that I have, particularly the WEF community that I've been a member of for a decade now, has been unbelievably important. And indeed, tapping into our incredible future of work community. And I know that we've stayed together and been together closer than we've ever been before. And let's make sure that we continue to look not just inside our organizations, but outside our companies. Now, it's 10:15 and time for questions. Anna.
Thanks, Lynda. So some great discussion in the chat, which we can talk about. So to expand on what people were saying that surprised them the most in the current context, people making space for caring responsibilities, thinking about the whole person, everyone being in the same boat. So even for those who were used to working from home, now that everyone is working from home, much more collaboration, communication, and things like that. Ability of employees to learn skills in very short time frames. So again, this speed and learning agility combined.
I've just seen Philip saying he has read the Democratic Enterprise. I knew that somebody out there would have read the Democratic Enterprise. It's out of print now, so keep hold of it. It's worth a fortune. Sorry,
just copy.
Yeah.
So the combination of speed and learning agility, and also that people feel they have more opportunities perhaps than they did in the past. So there's some interesting points coming out there.
Yes.
There was
Can I just make a comment on that, Anna? If anyone's doing, a number of you are saying, I can see, you know, that it's really important to have, you know, sorry, I'm trying to read the chat and talk, and of course I can't multitask, so let me just focus on talking. if you're doing something really interesting on learning, could you drop us a note, and we'll put together cases on anything you're doing where you've suddenly learned how to teach people. My intuition, which is sometimes right and often wrong, is that upskilling and reskilling is going to be the next big thing. And I think governments are going to talk to you. I, as you know, sit on both the Japanese government and also have a link into the UK government. So please do send us a note, and we can write that up as a series of cases, and maybe at the next masterclass in London we can talk about that. So thanks for that. Anna, back to you.
Thanks, Lynda. And so just picking up on a slight nuance on this inequality point that you mentioned. So Annie made a fascinating point around the need in highly regulated companies to maintain good conduct, and how it is easier to hide toxic or bad behaviour, tribal behaviours, toxic teams in this current way of working. So I think
say that again, Anna. Sorry, I missed.
It's easier to hide bad behaviours, tribal teams in this new way of working. And I think this leads to an interesting question around culture. I think so. If we have a hybrid way of working, some people in the office, some people working virtually, it would be great if you could expand on how this connects to culture, how you can maintain an inclusive culture whilst working in this hybrid way.
Yeah. Oh, these are all really difficult questions, and you know, and I think, to be honest, we're all learning. We don't really know how to build an inclusive culture in a hybrid world, but we're certainly going to be focusing on that over the coming weeks. So we haven't got a hybrid world yet. I know some of you are beginning to build that hybrid world. I think, you know, we're going to stay close to you, and when you're doing that, could you tell us about it? We have got the survey, by the way. And so one of the ways to find out more about what's happening is to get your employees to complete that survey. And that will tell us more, you know, just in terms of what we know that an inclusive culture is built through communication. And I remember that when the last webinar, when we used the word cloud and said, what is it you want leaders to do right now? The number one point you said about leadership is we want leaders to communicate. And I think that that's going to be absolutely crucial, because in a hybrid world, my assumption is, now this, I'm interested to test this out with you, but my assumption is that you run a company virtually, but some people are going to be in the office and some people are going to be at work. And, you know, so that you're not really, you know, when you move back to the office, it's not suddenly as if everybody in the office is the same team as they were, because some won't be able to get to the office for all sorts of reasons. So you are actually going to be running a virtual company for a long time. I mean, probably until we get a vaccine, and those of you in the medical fraternity will tell us when that's going to be, but I don't think it's anytime soon. So I think what you should be concentrating on now is saying, you know, we will be working virtually, but some of you will be working from home, and some of you will be working from home, and some of you will be working from the office. And so this question of virtual, you know, virtual behavior is going to be absolutely crucial. And we're just learning how to do that. We have very little. I speak as an academic. You know, it's interesting that when people say home working is more productive than office work, that's based on one study of Chinese call center people. There are very few proper balanced studies that look at the impact of working virtually, and certainly there's been nothing on knowledge workers which would pass academic rigor, the rules of academic rigor. So so we don't know, and so we're all learning together, and that's why I think within the Future of Work Consortium, you know, we started that 10 years ago. We're now in it. And so please reach out to us if you're doing anything about an inclusive culture in a hybrid world. Reach out to us, and we'll continue to talk to you about what you're finding. But I think that communication is going to be absolutely crucial. But I think we're going to have fatigue. You know, already the leaders I'm talking to, and I'm interested to see what you feel, are just tired. You know, they're tired of, as I'm doing now, talking into a little green speck. you know, they're tired of not getting that sort of positivity back. I mean, it's easier for me because even though I'm sitting here in Primrose Hill, I know most of you, you know, we have had cups of coffee, we have, you know, drank a glass of wine together. So it feels as if it's the community, but for many of your leaders, they don't know the people that they're talking to. And so the sort of connection that we've got within the Future Work Consortium, they don't have that connection. So I think, you know, the question of culture is crucial. We know it's about communication, but how we make that happen, I think, is the big question that we're facing. And we obviously, as research partners to you, would like to continue at that conversation. Back to you, Anna. You've got your...
Oh, sorry, unmute. Picking up on the point you were saying around fatigue and people being fatigued. So as we've already discussed, the speed of the response, the agility of people's responses, both in terms of learning, but just in terms of how stuff was able to get done, has been a big surprise. So how can organisations balance the two? So Margaret from KPMG mentioned balancing resilience and agility. How can you create an environment that balances those two so that you maintain all the benefits of the speed without, as you say, fatiguing people or depleting their well-being?
Yeah, I think we've really got to start thinking about blocks of time. It was interesting, actually. I sometimes speak on the Today programme, which is the BBC Radio 4 programme that comes out. I think it starts at 7 o'clock in the morning. It's the most listened to, one of the most listened to radio programmes in the world, actually. That team starts at, I think they start at 3 o'clock every morning. And what they do, and I notice it with my son who's a doctor, is they have shift work. You know, they're either on and they take time off. And I think we're going to have to do the same, actually. You know, this notion of 5-day working, that's factory. This is, I'm afraid we've still got the shadow of the Industrial Revolution over us. And the Industrial Revolution was based on people working in factories, and the factories, Anna's nodding because she did her PhD in some of this stuff. So she knows more about the Industrial Revolution than I do. But nevertheless, you know, that's really the basis of how we work. And, you know, it's causing us endless problems now. So, you know, my personal view is that you need to think about blocks of time where you really get people to speed up during that block, but you also give them time off. I mean, like proper time off, not, you know, I'm going to be answering my emails all the time, because otherwise you really are going to have mental health issues and you're going to have fatigue issues. So I think you've got to, we've said for years, you know, we've got to sort out internet. We've got to sort out the fact that people feel they have to answer emails all the time. This is the moment to sort that out, and think about it as if you were running a hospital, and think about it in shifts where you have, you know, shifts where people work flat out for a period of time and then they take a break. And then I'm also, of course, as you know, very keen on job share. If anyone's interested in that, drop me a note. But we need to be much more creative about how people use their time. We know that there are two things that really help people with regard to their own personal time. One is synchronicity. There's no point in you having time off if your partner doesn't have time off, or if your children have time. So that's why we like, you know, Christmas so much, because we all synchronize time around Christmas. We need to allow more of that. And to do that, we have to do the second thing, which is autonomy. People want autonomy about when they work and how they work. And the more that you can push work to being about outcomes rather than inputs, the more you're going to be able to manage that. And again, this is something you've been saying you want to do for years in the HR department. Now you've got the chance to really step up and do it. So it's a great opportunity, by the way, to redesign your HR strategy. And if you aren't doing that, then, you know, this is the moment. We're here to help, obviously, to do that. Yeah, and as you say, Jan, this business of everyone being in the same boat is a huge opportunity for you. You know, quite a lot of your senior leaders do not like people working from home. And now they're working from home and they're saying, oh my God, this is really hard. I'm having to work really, really long hours. So I think there's a much deeper level of understanding and empathy. And if particularly those of you in the HR department, you need to now, this is the moment when work is being redesigned. Now, either you actively redesign it or it will just take root itself. This is the moment for you to pull up the weeds of bureaucracy and to plant new working practices. But you have to do it quickly, and you have to do it consultatively, because otherwise it'll just happen in its own way, and you're going to be upset next year when you've got some of the worst aspects of bureaucracy back taking roots.
Great, thanks, Lynda. And one final question, just to expand the points you were mentioning there, which is how can organisations make sure that this change is sustained, so that this moment is actually used as an opportunity to enact change further into the future?
Yeah, well, I think I think part of what we're moving into is a period of flux. So I don't think we're going to build stuff that's going to be sustained. I think we're going to go through a period of experimentation where we try new things, we adopt some of them, we let some of them go. And so, you know, the iterative process that we've talked about in the future of work for so many years now, I think that's now possible. But what I would say is don't let the roots of bureaucracy start to build themselves down again. And particularly those of you in Japan, and you know that I've done a number of webinars specifically for Japan in the last week. Drop us a note if you haven't seen them. And there I've talked both to Nikkei and to the Japanese society, specifically about Japan not going back to hierarchical leadership. I think this is a really important opportunity to break with the past.
Great, thanks, Lynda. And thank you very much to everyone for all your fascinating comments in the chat. And I'll pass back to you, Lynda, to wrap up.
Thank you, Anna. Well, a couple of points really. First is, let's continue the conversation. Those of you who are in the Future of Work Consortium know that we're here. If you aren't in the Future of Work Consortium, please join. But for everybody, let's continue the conversation and take the COVID-19 survey. We designed this survey actually quite early on. We designed it in March, thinking that a lot of people would want to do the survey, and indeed that's proven to be right. So it's free. If you want more information, then just we've sent you a note and get your company to do it. If you have enough data, then we can tell you something about what we've seen in your company. Because I think in the end, really understanding what's going on will be about collecting data. So please do continue the conversation. It's great to have so many people here today. Thank you for being here, and thank you particularly to our Future of Work Consortium members. Wonderful to see you. Thank you to Anna, to Kyra, and to Callie for all their work. The pandemic webinar series is still available, and this afternoon you'll receive a document that's got the key insights from the webinar, alongside an invitation for a complimentary consultation with one of the members of the team of HSM to support you moving forward. So let's make sure that we continue the conversation. The Future of Work Consortium was created more than 10 years ago. Thank you to all those people who've been with us, some of you who've been with us for 10 years. Let's continue this conversation. This is our moment. Thank you.